if you want to build a GraphQL API with AWS AppSync, we would either choose Amplify framework or Serverless framework. Now, this framework really makes our life easy to create the GraphQL schema, resolvers, data sources, and any other AWS resources for our applications. Now in Enlear Academy, I have created many videos on how to use Amplify framework to create AppSync APIs. Now if you are interested, I would recommend you watching the online bookstore project that is built with AWS Amplify. Now in today's video, I will teach you how we can use Serverless framework to create your AppSync API. And for this, I'm going to be using the Serverless AppSync plugin. So what are we going to build today? So we are going to create some functionalities of the online bookstore project that we have earlier created with AWS Amplify, but this time with Serverless framework. Well, before we get into that, I just want to tell you one other thing. So this is the Amplify framework documentation, and you can see Amplify framework is not just one thing. So it is comprised of 4 components or 4 modules, I would say. The Amplify libraries, Amplify CLI, Amplify console, and the new Amplify admin UI. The serverless framework, particularly the plugin that we are going to use, is going to replace the Amplify CLI. So we will use serverless framework to provision the resources and also create our schema. But that doesn't mean we can't use other components like the Amplify library to communicate with the AppSync API that is provisioned or created through serverless framework. And this is of course possible, and in the next video I will show you how to do that. Okay, so here's what we are going to implement today. So we are going to design an API for an online bookstore, and in this particular bookstore we have admins and users or customers really. Now only the admins can add the books to the store. So the logged in users, they can view all the books, and also a user can view the details of a certain book that he is interested in. If he's really interested, he can go ahead and place the order. Now this is the overview of today's implementation. Now let's look at the steps that we are going to follow. Well, first and foremost, we are going to provision AWS resources. Now we are not going to go into AWS console and create the AppSync API from the console, but instead we are going to use infrastructure as code. Or it would be more like infrastructure as configuration, because we are going to use CloudFormation with serverless framework. So using CloudFormation, we are going to create 2 DynamoDB tables, one to store books and the other one to store orders. Next, we are going to create a Cognito user pool to store our users. Now, just AWS user pool is not enough for application because we need to handle 2 types of users. So we are going to create 2 AWS Cognito user groups, one for admin and one for the customers. And then we are going to create a separate IAM role for the users in the admin group, which will grant them more permission, particularly to create books in the books table. So that's our first step. We provision AWS resources. And after that, we're going to go ahead and design our GraphQL schema. For that, we'll be using the plugin that I showed you earlier. And after that, we are going to associate group-based authorization for the relevant GraphQL fields. And then we'll test the API. And next, I will show you how we can attach a front end to consume the API that we provision and configure through serverless framework. Okay, so let's break this implementation into multiple videos so that I can cover each and every step with more clarity, taking time. Okay, one final slide before we go into the code. Now this is our AppSync API, and in this video we are going to create 2 data sources for it. First, Amazon DynamoDB data source and AWS Lambda data source. We will also create the corresponding resolvers so that AppSync API can communicate with these downstream services. Alright, so let's get started. I will open up Visual Studio Code, and I'm going to create a new folder, Serverless AppSync demo, and create, and then open it in. Next, I will take the integrated terminal again, and let's install Serverless CLI. npm install-g serverless. Right. Let's check the version SLS-V. So I have 2.25. Then let's create a folder for our backend. So I'll call it just backend. I'll cd into backend, clear the screen. Then let's create a serverless service using the serverless CLI. For that, I will use SLS create. You can use serverless create as well, -- template. And I'll be using AWS Node.js template. Now we have this serverless YAML file where all the configuration lies. I'll remove the comments and I'll change the service name from backend to Serverless AppSync backend. Region I'll set to USD2, and I removed most of the comments except for this resource section because we are going to provision some resources as our first step. So let's create our resources. I'll remove this part. Now under this resources logical ID, we can define CloudFormation. And I will define my CloudFormation script in a separate file. So inside the backend folder, I'll create a file called resources.yml, and then I'll refer that file here. Using $n file in serverless, we can refer a particular file. Now this is the path to the file, that is resources.yml. Now in the resources YAML file, let's start creating our backend resources. First, we need two tables, DynamoDB tables, one for the books and also another one for holding our orders. So I'll call the logical name books table, and then this is the type of DynamoDB. Now, if you are not familiar about CloudFormation, you can easily go to Google and just search for DynamoDB CloudFormation. Now, in the documentation, you can see the JSON format as well as YAML format. So let's use the YAML format. So I will just copy the entire thing and then paste it in. I'll use 2 spaces here and then do another formatting. Good. So this is the type of DynamoDB table. That's good. And then we have to define the properties. We need to define the attributes of our DynamoDB table. Now, I can further look into the format of the attribute definition. If I come here to the documentation, you see there's a link. If I click on it, then I will see the format and the attribute that it expects. So I have to have the attribute name and then the attribute type. And if you really look at it at the properties section, attribute name is a required attribute and also attribute type is a required attribute. So both of these has to be filled. So let's first copy these two so that we won't make any spelling mistakes. Attribute name is book ID. Now this is the hash key or the primary key of our book table, and this is of the type string. So let's add the capital S, which denotes string. The billing mode is pay per request. Now how do I know it is pay per request? If I again go to CloudFormation of the DynamoDB table, right here in the billing mode, if I click into the attribute this time, I should see the value that I can assign there. Either it can be provision or pay per request. So I'm using pay per request. For this table, I don't need any global secondary indexes, so I will take this out. And next, I need to define what the key schema is. So basically, I need to define what are the key attribute. So here again, I will show in the first example how do you actually look up all this information. So if you look at it under key schema, there's the value. So this is the array. And if I click on it, then it's again the type of two attributes like attribute name and the key type. Replace that again here. So the key attribute name is book ID and the key type, now this is a hash key. In DynamoDB table, we have hash and sort keys, but for this table, we only have a hash key. I don't have secondary indexes, so take it out. And I'm not going to specify table name even. So I'll let CloudFormation to name my table. And then if I want to reference my table, I will use logical ID reference in serverless. I'll show you. And the rest of these attributes, I don't need it except for tags. I don't need time to leave specification as well. For tag, again, I will quickly see the format. Here under tag, it's array. If I click here, so I need to specify key and the value. Let's give a name for our table so that we can later find our table with the tags. I will just call it books table. Now this is our books table. I need order table as well. Let me copy this one, paste it. This is order table, DynamoDB table type. For attribute definition, we have several attributes. Firstly, we should be able to look up all the orders by a user or by user ID. So we need user ID as one of the attribute. And then I should always need the order ID so I can query with order ID at any time. This is also a type of string. And then I would also need the book ID. Now the main hash key and the range key of this order table would be user ID and order ID. And I will create couple of secondary indexes so I can query information with the book IDs as well. Because as an admin, I would really need to see how a certain book really perform, like how many orders has happened for that particular book. I'll add another attribute. This time it is created at what time this order has been created. That would help me to find out the book sales over a certain period. Let's say for January or February likewise. So these are the attributes and the billing mode is paper request. So the key schema. Now we have two attributes for our main table, that is user ID is going to be our hash key, and also I will have order ID as the sort key or the range key. Now this is for our main table. Then I'm going to go ahead and define some global secondary indexes. Now I can go back to the documentation right here. Now here it is. So let me copy this one and let's see how it expects the values. So this is an array and global secondary index. So it requires these attributes. Do a little bit of formatting. Now with the main hash key and the range key, I can query the orders of a certain user. And for this first global secondary index, I want to query by the book ID as well. So for my index name, I will call it by order. So this is the index name. And for the key schema, so it is pretty much these values that I need to provide. Hash key would be book ID and the range key would be created at. Okay, I think that should be enough for our global secondary index. I just want to show you how we can define global secondary indexes. And then we have defined the projection for this global secondary index. Now projection is it's really like how many attributes are being copied over from the main table to the index. Now here, let's see what values it expects. If I go to projection, so I will define the projection type and I'll add the projection type as all. I need to copy over all the attributes from our main table to global secondary index, so I can query any attributes from the global secondary index directly. I'll remove the provision throughput because we are not using provision throughput. Then the tags, this is order table. Okay, now it looks good. So we have created the books table and also the order table. Okay, what are the other resources I need to provision ahead of the time? Well, I need to create a user pool. So this is where I'm gonna store all my users. So let's say this is Cognito user pool. I'll give it a logical ID. No, Cognito user pool. Simple and straightforward. Then I will go back to the documentation. This time I'll search for Cognito user pool CloudFormation. Now here I can see the CloudFormation for Cognito user pool. Now after we have provisioned a user pool, we need to provision a user pool client so that our front end can communicate with the user pool through this web client. And then we are going to create user pool groups, so I can create my admin group and user group or customer group. So let's go ahead and first create our user pool. So I'm here, and then I'll just copy over these attributes directly from the YAML. Of course, you are not going to use all these attributes, but I'll paste it anyways, and let's remove the things that I don't need. So here type, of course, I need it, Cognito user pool type, then the properties I need it, but I would only need three properties really. First, I would need the user pool name. So here, if I come over here, user pool name is required for me. And then I would also need the username attributes. And then I would need to define the schema for our user pool. So only those three attributes. So let me take out the rest. We'll use the defaults that Cognito user pools gives us. Okay, for our user pool name, let's define a user pool name. YouTube books to user pool. Username attributes. So this would be email. So what does username attributes means? So if you're unclear, just click on this attribute, then you'll get the definition. Determines whether email address or the phone numbers can be specified as usernames when user signs up. When users are signing up, I want to use their email. So that's why I added email here. Okay, then the schema. Now for schema, I can define any attributes if I need. But well, on the second thought, I will remove this one as well. So we don't need any additional attributes really. So let's keep it simple. So it's only username, user pool name, and the user name attributes. So that's our Cognito user pool. Then let's create our Cognito user pool client so our application can communicate with that client. Because to communicate with the user pool, you can't directly do it except for through a client. So here, this is our Cognito user pool client, and I click on that. Now this is the configuration. And here we are not going to do anything fancy, but only creating the user pool client and attach it to the user pool we just created. So I think we would need a couple of attributes, not all of these. So let's see, of course, we need the type and the properties. This is Cognito user pool client. It's not Cognito, it's Cognito client. And the type is a pool client. So as for the properties, I would need the client name. So let's call it web. And then I need to reference the user pool that this client associate with. So there's attribute called user pool ID. And here I need to reference my user pool I created up here. So how we can do that? We can use the intrinsic function ref and then just refer the Cognito user pool logical ID here. Now here it's expecting the user pool ID. So how do I know this intrinsic function is returning the user pool ID? That's very easy. I will go to the user pool, CloudFormation configuration. If you scroll a little bit down here, you should see there's a return section. There we go, return values. So this ref returns the generated ID, such as this one. So now I know if I just use ref and reference the logical ID of the user pool, then it's going to return me the ID of the user pool. If I need to get the ARN and so on, I'm going to have to use get ATT intrinsic function. So it's all there in the documentation, very easy. Okay, so we created the user pool client and also we associate it with the user pool. Then we would need to create our user pool groups. First, let's create the admin group. I'll give it a name, Cognito admin group. In the CloudFormation, I will select this one, Cognito user pool. Sorry, not that one. Now in the documentation, I will select this one, Cognito user pool group. Then I should be able to see the type and the properties it expects. I'll copy this entire thing, paste it. So type is of user pool group, properties, description. So we can say admin users belongs to this group. Let's call this group admin. And the precedence value. Now if a user is part of, let's say, multiple group, then which group should be prioritized? So this time I'll set the priority 0. That means it gets the highest priority. Now here again I need to reference the user pool ID. So let's do the same intrinsic function. And yes, I did not skip this. Now we need to define the IAM role for this Cognito group. Now I mentioned in the slides for our admins, they have extra permissions. So this is where we need to define a role with those extra permission. Now I need to define another resource here that is an IAM role. So we need to fill here. So to do that, let's go ahead and create an IAM role. Cognito admin IAM role. For the logical ID, I will say this is Cognito admin IAM role. And then I will go back to Google and search for IAM CloudFormation. Here we go. So I'll copy these YAML attributes, paste it here. So type is IAM role. What properties do I need? So I need to keep the role name. So let's call this role name YouTube Bookstore admin role. I'll skip the tags. I'll not defining any permission boundaries or paths or maximum session duration or manage policy ARNs. Now I need to provide values for these attributes. Assume role policy document and the policies. So what does assume role policy document means? That means I need to specify who or what service can assume this particular role. Now obviously Cognito should be able to assume this role. So it is a JSON. We need to put it here. So let's do that. For all the policy versions, we need to define the version. So let's use this. Now you can find all this information in the documentation, but for the time's sake, I'm not showing that. You can just follow along. Then I need to define the statements, policy statements. So this is a effect allow policy. So it's going to allow these permissions, not deny. Then I need to define the principal. That means who can really assume this particular role. So now the Cognito is going to assume this role. So that's a federation. So let's define this is federated principal, and then I'll define the name or the domain for Cognito. It is cognito-identity.amazonaws.com. So what are the actions that Cognito can do? So it can assume this role. So let's add this STS assume role permission action really. STS assume role with web identity. Okay, with this assume role policy, Cognito is able to assume this particular role. Not anything else, like EC2 instance cannot assume this particular role, but only for Cognito, that's what we define here. Okay, next. Okay, although now it assumes it, what permission does this policy really let Cognito to do? So that's what we need to define it in the policies section. So first we need to define the policy name. So let's call it bookstore admin group policy. Let YouTube bookstore admin group policy. And then I need to define the policy document just like before. Here, let's add the version. Again, this is 2012, 10, 17. After that, the statements. So again, this is a allow policy. Effect is allow. And what action once the Cognito has assumed this can do. So let's add an array. So basically, the users in the admin groups will assume this. And I want all these admin users to access the books table because they need to create books in the bookstore. Not our users can do that. So let's say the action is DynamoDB star. So they can do anything for DynamoDB, but for these resources. So I'll add an array of resources. First, let's add the books table. So I need to refer the ARN of the books table. So how can I do that? Now I define the books table right up here. But if I need to get the ARN, we need to use a particular intrinsic function. So how can we search for it? So I'll again go to a new tab, search for DynamoDB CloudFormation. Scroll down and I'll go to the return sections. Here we go, return values. If I just use ref, it's going to return the name of the table, which is not what I need. So I need to get the ARN. So that's what I need to use, get ATT intrinsic function, which returns the ARN. So let's do that right here. I will just use get ATT or get attribute. Now I need to refer the logical name books table dot ARN, right? And let's add permission to edit the orders as well, just in case if an admin wants to do that. So this time get ATT, so they should be able to interfere with the order table as well if there's an issue with the order. Okay, so this looks good. So we create the Cognito admin role, but now we need to refer it in the role ARN. So how can we do that? Pretty easy. Again, I will use the get ATT, and this time I'm referencing the IAM role.ARN. Okay. Anything did we miss? Yes, description here for the IAM role. This is the IAM role that admin group users assume. Okay, good. So we created one of the groups, but we need to create another group for our users. Well, that is straightforward because I can copy from the admin group and admin IAM role. So let me in fact do that. Copy this resource and the other resource so I don't have to type it out again. Hit enter, paste it. Okay, so let's use another group, or let's create another group, and this time let's call it customer group. I'll change the admin to customer, so Cognito customer group. Let's say user pool group type. Our customers belongs to this group, and let's call this customer, the group name as customer. And I'll set the precedence value 1. If a user belongs to both customer and admin, then he will be an admin because lower precedence values get priority. So then I have to define the role ARN. So I will change Cognito admin role to Cognito use IAM role, and I copy this one, paste it here. User pool ID is not going to be changed because we are attaching this group to the same user pool. And then we need to do some changes right here. So for the assume role policy, it's not going to be changed. Cognito is going to assume it. Now for the policy document, it needs to be changed. So let's first change the policy name to YouTube Bookstore Customer Group Policy. And then let's define the permission for the customer. So what can customer do? Basically, he can list out all the books and he can create orders. So he should have full access to the orders table. So I will take out the books table out here. So he will have full access to order table. But I need them to view the books. So let me copy this permission statement and I will paste it here again. So this time it's allowing DynamoDB not everything but get item. And also they should be able to query the DynamoDB table. So query. So now this is another operation to the DynamoDB table. So that should also be possible. And also they should be able to get item as batches. I mean, if it is required in future. Batch get items. And this is for our books table. And the role name, I'll change it to YouTube Bookstore customer role. Okay, it looks all good. Let's double check. Now here I need to change the description. Okay, the rest looks good. And I think these are the main resources we need to provision. So if I recap, we need a books DynamoDB table to store books. And then to store orders, we need another DynamoDB table. And then to store our users, we need a Cognito user pool. And for our application to connect to this user pool, we need a user pool client. And our application has multiple user roles. So we are handling those authorization through user pool groups. So I created an admin group and also a customer group. And all the users inside the admin group will have this admin IAM role, which provides them the permission that admin has. And also to define the permission for a user, we have created another IAM role and associated with the customer group. So all the users that is inside these groups will inherit those corresponding permissions. So let's go ahead and run this. So I'll do SLS deploy. Before that, let me just double check here. Okay, it looks all good. So I added the default stage as dev and I'll do SLS deploy. Let's see if there's any issues with our CloudFormation. All right, so the serverless deployment is successful. So I believe the CloudFormation has run successfully. So let's check. All right, so I'm in my AWS console. Let's first check our two tables. I will go to DynamoDB. I'm in UST2 region where I configured in serverless YAML file. Then go to tables. I have a set of tables. Let's find out our two tables that was created. Now, easy way to find your table is to look up the service name. This should be the prefix really, serverless AppSync backend. Let's check that. And here we go, serverless AppSync backend. Okay, so we have serverless AppSync backend, then the stage dev, then the order table and some suffix. So our order table is created and it has one of the indexes. So let's check that one. And here we go. So our primary partition key or the primary key is user ID. Sort key for the main table is order ID. And if I go to indexes, then I have the by order index we just created. And it has the partition key of book ID. And it has sort key of created at. Okay, that's great. Next, this is our books table. If I open it up again, go to the OV section, then I can see its primary key is book ID. And we have not configured a sort key here. and there's no indexes for the books table. Okay, great. So we have our two tables in the DynamoDB. So next, let's check our user pool. I will go to Cognito, manage user pools. Now this time we can look up with the user pool name that we have given. So what is the user pool name that we gave? And here we go, YouTube Bookstore user pool. And this is the user pool. Okay, good. Then we attach a user pool client. So if I go to app clients, then we can see the web app client we configured. So the Cognito has set up some default configuration for us, like, refresh token expiration days and so on. I think this is all right. Next, let's go to our users and groups and see if our two groups are created. Yes, those are created. Here's the admin group and the customer group. So if I go ahead and open the admin group, then I can see the IAM role attached to it. So this is the IAM role. So let me just copy this IAM role name, service, and I search for IAM. Right click, open it in a new tab, go to roles, and I will search for it. And here is the IAM role. So if I open it up, then I can see the permissions that is attached to it. Expand this, and here we go. So it is allowing full access to both of our tables, books table and the order table. So notice that it has correctly referenced our ARNs through the logical ID references. Very nice. So similarly, you can also look up the customer group, and it should have its own customer role. I'll search that. Here we go. Open it up. And for this customer policy, we have two statements. One with full access to the orders table, and the other one with read access, get item query and batch item to the books table. So it looks all good, but unfortunately it takes a lot of time when we are going over each and every steps. So let's take a break, and I'll see you in the next video where we'll configure the AppSync API using the serverless plugin. Hope to see you soon.